Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. Military strategists like their threats visible. Tanks, troops, missile launches, things you can point at on a map. But some of the most consequential parts of Russia's war effort are moving quietly through European waters, flying foreign flags, carrying oil, and sometimes something much more dangerous. Now, this isn't just about rusty tankers and environmental risk. It's about a shadow fleet that bankrolls Russia's war, probes Europe's legal limits, and blurs the line between civilian shipping and hostile action. And the uncomfortable truth is this. While Moscow has adapted, Europe is still arguing about the rulebook. So, without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
The Russian shadow fleet is evolving. There recently has been a rise in the number of flag swaps made by vessels which are part of the sanctioned fleet. Many ships that used to obscure their origins or connections to Russia are now directly registering as belonging to the Russian Federation.
On European Union level, we have been discussing that. European Union has a strong influence on trade policies, visa policies and so on, of denial of services to those who are giving the flags, for example, to shadow fleet ships.
While that is how the shadow fleet used to operate, this pressure from the European Union and NATO countries has led to a shift in how Russia chooses to mark its shadow fleet. By providing the ships with official registration, Moscow seems to believe that they will be better protected in the wake of Western countries' authorities boarding the vessels. Despite this tactical shift, however, the EU is not expected to simply stand idly by and let these vessels breach sanctions, even if they sail under Russian flags. While EU authorities will be wary of dragging themselves into some sort of deeper conflict with the Russians over the ships, the sanctions regime on Russia must be maintained. These recent moves show that the Kremlin is scrambling to a certain degree, and if the sanctions can finally deal a hefty blow to the Russian economy, that could perhaps ease the pressure on Ukraine itself.
And now, let's zone in on the east-planing portion of our show. The Russian shadow fleet has become one of the primary ways through which the Russian Federation has been avoiding Western sanctions. The solution seems obvious at first glance: stop these ships from transporting sanctions goods and resources. But the matter requires a far more delicate touch than simply boarding the vessels and shutting this whole enterprise down.
For the past several months, Russia has focused on using a shadow fleet of tankers to maintain all transportation routes despite imposed sanctions. This fleet, which numbers in the hundreds, is usually used in the Baltic Sea. Despite these tankers being poorly maintained and therefore posing a risk to the environment, Moscow has very little choice than to rely on them if it wants to maintain one of the pillars of its economy. Nevertheless, Baltic Sea states have been very reluctant to take strong action against the fleet over fears of retaliation from the Russian side. For example, the current regional controls are focused more on paperwork checks and monitoring rather than full interception and vessel seizures. Even though there have been some pan-EU and pan-NATO initiatives meant to crack down on the shadow fleet, the enforcement remains very limited. There are also some legal constraints binding these countries from simply being able to seize any ship that is suspected of ferrying Russian resources. The easiest solution would be to seal the Baltic Sea off completely so that the Russians could not send their ships out there, but experts warn that this would likely force Russia's hand to strike back, very possibly in a military manner.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. For years, Europe has comforted itself with the idea that sanctions are a clean, legal, almost technocratic tool. You pass them, you enforce them, and eventually the bad behavior stops. But Russia didn't get that memo. Instead, Moscow built itself a floating workaround, a shadow fleet that now stretches into the hundreds, quietly moving oil, money, and sometimes something far more dangerous through European waters. Now, on paper, these ships are mundane. Aging tankers running on dubious insurance, flags of convenience from countries whose maritime authorities are either overwhelmed or uninterested. In reality, they're an integral part of Russia's war economy and increasingly its hybrid warfare toolkit, particularly in the Baltic Sea. This fleet does more than keep Russian oil flowing despite sanctions. According to security analysts, it offers cover for intelligence operations and even platforms for sabotage. Now, we've seen allegations of drone launches disrupting Danish airspace. We've seen undersea cables mysteriously damaged, and we've seen how quickly civilian shipping becomes a legal shield behind which hostile activities can hide. None of this is accidental. Russian intelligence has used civilian vessels for espionage since the early Soviet period. What's new is the scale and the level of senior political investment. Figures like Admiral Igor Kostukov, head of Russia's military intelligence, and Nikolai Patrushev, long godfather of the Kremlin security worldview, are not micromanaging oil tankers for profit alone. They're rebuilding a doctrine: deniability through civilian infrastructure. Europe's response so far has been cautious, to say the least. Officials tend to frame the shadow fleet as an environmental problem, and yeah, many of these ships are floating liabilities. Old hulls, poor maintenance, questionable crews. That framing, though, allows inspections and occasional detention over a safety violation. It is safe, it is legal, but it is completely insufficient. Because Russia isn't operating in good faith, and it isn't operating strictly within the law either. It's exploiting legal gray zones deliberately, and responding to gray zone tactics with bureaucratic compliance is losing strategy. Some analysts argue Europe needs to change how it conceptualizes the problem from environmental risk to geopolitical threat. That doesn't mean abandoning maritime law, but it does mean using it creatively and collectively. Existing conventions already contain loopholes that allow inspections, detentions, and prolonged scrutiny when sanction evasion is suspected. The problem isn't the absence of tools, it's the absence of political will to use them systematically. The shadow fleet is a test of Europe's ability to recognize hybrid threats, of its willingness to operate in legal ambiguity when adversaries already do. Eventually, Russia will push too far. And when it does, European democracies must be ready with coordinated intelligence, legal resolve, and, if necessary, force. Because lawlessness at sea does not stop itself, it has to be checked. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Elizabeth Brom, Senior Fellow from Transatlantic Security Initiative of the Atlantic Council. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello.
So today we're trying to examine the Russians' shadow fleet, and the immediate thing that comes into mind is why is it so hard to deter them from using it? The term shadow fleet would imply something very mysterious, but at this point the cat's out of the bag and everyone knows about it. So why is nothing being done?
Well, it's being public is not a problem for these vessels. Everybody knows that they exist. They've existed for decades. Not as many, but the concept has been around for decades. South Africa used shadow vessels back in the 80s. Venezuela, Iran, North Korea have used shadow vessels for many years. And the reason that countries use shadow vessels is they need to get around sanctions. Because officially sailing vessels are not allowed to transport cargo that is sanctioned. So if you want to import and export cargo that is sanctioned and you don't want to change your way to have the sanctions lifted, then you should use the shadow fleet, which is what Russia has done since December 2022. And the problem is that under international maritime law, you can't just ban the shadow fleet. If you want to ban an individual vessel from sailing your waters, you have to have specific specific points that vessel is violating, and that's what countries in the Baltic Sea have been trying to do. But it's very hard work because you have to ban each or detain or investigate or sanction each vessel individually, and that takes a lot of work.
All right. Is there a way in which that enforcement can kind of speed up the procedure or fire some sort of a warning shot by, for example, like how the United States seized a Venezuelan oil tanker that is essentially halted a lot of the trade that's going on?
Well, what you can do is investigate individual vessels, check their insurance documentation, which they in most cases lack, investigate their seaworthiness and so forth. But that's on an individual basis. Then when it comes to what the United States has been doing in detaining Venezuelan oil tankers, that is a very risky strategy. What the United States is doing is detaining Venezuelan shadow tankers in international waters. And clearly, U.S. government lawyers have signed off on it and will have found a way to make this, to proceed on a legal basis. But it is a very questionable strategy, because you, as the coastal state, only have rights, territorial rights within your territorial waters, in your exclusive economic zone, and most especially in international waters, you have far fewer rights, and in international waters you have no rights at all. It's a global commons. So if you decide to detain countries flagged in another country in international waters, then you will face not only questions regarding the legality of what you've done, but you will also, frankly, put your own vessels at risk, because when they sail internationally outside your own territorial waters, then other countries can say, well, we are going to detain your vessels because you detained vessels linked to our country when they were sailors.
All right. Now, a lot of criticism from the lack or slow action when it comes to dealing with the shadow fleet. People are saying that it has something to do with the lack of political will, be it worried about escalation, or some of these countries have actually their own economic interests. Do you think those are valid forms of argument, or is it really just procedural and logistical?
I would invite European governments, countries in the Baltic Sea, for having done too little. I would invite them to test out the proposals that they are making, namely detain many more vessels, even thinking that I've heard such proposals made. I would invite them to test out those proposals, and they would quickly discover that that would be extremely dangerous. You have to have a legal basis when you intervene against vessels. Otherwise, you undermine the global maritime order on which we all depend. We all depend on countries following maritime rules, countries and companies following maritime rules, because if countries and companies don't follow maritime rules, we are not going to have global shipping, we are not going to have global trade. There has to be a commitment to the rule of law on the high seas, and indeed on every part of the oceans. The second thing is, if you decide to if you say, well, the shadow vessels are violating maritime rules, we are going to violate maritime rules, then you expose, you not only undermine the global maritime order, but you expose vessels linked to your country, either flagged in your country, owned in your country, or carrying cargo to or from your country. You expose them to risks when they travel through other countries' waters. And we saw that in 2019, for example, when Iran, in response to a sanctioned vessel having been detained by the UK, detained a vessel that was flagged in the UK, that was sailing in Iran's exclusive economic zone, although Iran said it was in Iranian territorial waters. Either way, it detained this vessel, the Stena Impero, owned in Sweden, flagged in the UK, and detained it and held the crew for several weeks. So these are the sort of perils that you face if you decide that they are not going to be completely committed to the global maritime order.
All right. Another interesting thing that I've been observing is when talking about these shadow fleets, the EU government actually do put a lot of focus on the ecological impact, saying that these fleets are old, sometimes they leak oil, which does seem like it's kind of a molehill when it compares to Russia's hybrid war and sanction evasion. Do you think that this rhetoric has something to do with the fact that perhaps this is a valid form of trying to circumvent some of those maritime laws, or are there any reasons to specifically focusing on the ecological factor?
Well, every shadow vessel every shadow tanker in particular that sails through other countries' waters is an environmental hazard. So the global tanker fleet is very heavily regulated with good reason, because it is extremely harmful to any country and to any body of water when an oil spill takes place. That's why over the years the world has seen more and more regulation, supervision of the global oil tanker fleet, and indeed of the remaining tanker fleet, so tankers that transport other things like noxious materials. The shadow tankers sail outside this system. They are often unseaworthy. They are very old, and we know they don't have functioning P&I insurance, accident insurance. And what that means is that each one of them, every time it sails through any body of water, it poses a substantial environmental hazard to that body of water. And because these vessels don't have functioning accident insurance, what it means that if they have an accident, if they have an oil spill, that country then not only has to clean up, but has to pay for it. And as we know, oil spills are extremely dangerous and harmful to the local fishermen, but most importantly to the water itself, to the marine environment, to the fish and other living creatures in that body of water. So it is extremely dangerous, and I have been very encouraged to see Greenpeace starting to focus on the shadow fleet. Greenpeace is not an organization that focuses a lot on geopolitics, but it does focus on the shadow fleet precisely because the shadow fleet poses a substantial danger to the marine environment.
And coming back to geopolitics, how do countries around Russia or those affected by the shadow fleets hybrid warfare attempts like cutting sea cables or incursion into their water space kind of deal with the situation without, like you mentioned, having to violate the international maritime law? How do they balance the need for security and also upholding the rule of law?
Well, this is the dilemma for countries in the Baltic Sea region in particular, because so many Russian shadow vessels sail through the Baltic Sea on their way to and from Russia's Baltic ports. But the countries in the Baltic Sea region and Northern Europe and Eastern Europe, the eastern flank in particular, are also heavily targeted by other Russian harmful actions. And that is a question that comes up all the time. Should we retaliate eye for eye? So if Russia, for example, engages in arson, which has already now taken place several times, including in Poland, should we then arrange for somebody to set fire to buildings in Moscow if Russia interferes with our critical national infrastructure, whether it be undersea cables, water plants, the internet, or anything else? Should we retaliate by doing the same thing to Russia? And it's a suggestion that comes up all the time. People say our governments are cowardly and so forth. But if you, as a Western country, use the same methods as a rule-breaking country like Russia, then it's a race to the bottom. Russia is not going to change its ways simply because you start using the same means. It's going to accelerate, intensify the ways in which it harms our countries using non-military means. So it's a race to the bottom, and you then also lose the platform from which you can tell other countries to follow the rules. And that is a platform we still have as Western countries, as European countries. We can tell other countries, you should follow the rules that you have signed out to in various international treaties. If we stop doing it, then we have no right to tell other countries to do that anymore.
Right. So thank you so much for helping us unpack all these complexities. Really appreciate it. And thanks for being with us on Eastern Express.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. The Russian business sector seemed to have had quite enough of the Russian government's recent nationalization wave. The country's business leaders have formally asked Putin to curb the nationalization process.
During the Soviet era, it was the so-called kulaks who opposed Moscow's policy of nationalizing basically everything. In 2025, it's Russia's business and C-suite cast. Their formal plea to the Russian leader comes after many major companies and assets were seized by the Kremlin. The executives say that widespread takeovers have hurt customers' and clients' confidence in their brands across the board. They also point out that the justifications for nationalization are far too broad, as vague rights claims are often used to push forward state control. The business leaders emphasize in addition that the state should pay for an asset if it needs it rather than move towards confiscation. The latest wave of seizures, which targeted everything from car dealers to ports, is seen as a way to fill budget holes caused by Western sanctions.
Since the start of the invasion of Ukraine, Russia has been gradually switching to wartime economy. The country's military spending has been soaring year on year and reached record levels in 2025.
Although the sky sometimes seems to be the limit when it comes to military spending in wartime, some observers believe that in Russia's case, that sky may have been reached. There have been signs that the country's defense industry growth is slowing down compared to its previous rapid expansion. Industrial output growth has been dropping sharply, most likely due to Russia's wider economic problems. Several defense manufacturing sectors, such as electronics, have been decreasing production output. A plethora of structural problems has also been plaguing the Russian war industry, such as procurement delays, graft, and even layoffs at key companies after an initial hiring spree. Nevertheless, Russia is still expected to sustain its core military production levels, though sanctions could significantly erode more advanced projects over time.
Ukrainian intelligence is warning that Russia is preparing for yet another round of recruitment in the coming year. Due to the massive losses that the Russians have reportedly suffered in Ukraine, it has become a priority for Moscow to replace boots on the ground.
According to the head of Ukrainian military intelligence, Russia is planning to recruit more than 400,000 new troops in 2026. In comparison, Russia reportedly managed to not only meet but even exceed its 2025 recruitment target. Most of the new recruits are contract soldiers and not conscripts, as mobilization is highly unpopular in Russia. Yet in many cases, these contract soldiers have been lured into service with false promises or coerced into signing military contracts. High financial incentives are also used by Russian authorities to attract new recruits. Moscow has also been recruiting not only foreign nationals, but also convicts in exchange for benefits like lesser prison sentences.
And that's all for this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.